architecture in general. Then we think, okay, here's the controller layer. Here's all the fiddly bits we need to do to change state, interact with users. And then we're going to put the view layer. That's sort of like the candy or the icing or the beauty on top of the software. So it's very easy to break our stories up and say, okay, do all this on the model. Then we need to do all this in the controller. And then this is what the UI is going to look like. The problem that happens is that once you start doing like a little bit of the model, sort of like remodeling a kitchen, you just kind of keep busting things down and hanging new tile and fixing new plumbing and wiring things. And I'll change out the wiring while I'm here. So you get a tremendous amount of scope creep on the model. Then you start doing the controller and you're like, oh crap, none of this stuff fits together. Because usually it's like different teams or different people doing the controller. And then there's a whole different team doing the view. And then you try to fit this like house of cards together. And you're like, oh crap, we overbuilt the model completely. The controller isn't quite right because it doesn't sync with the view. And oh, by the way, the view's completely doing the wrong thing. That's not what I meant. I know that's what I said, but that's not what I meant now that I see it. And so it's really important to slice layers of the cake, where you work on a very teeny part of the model, a very teeny part of the controller, and a very teeny part of the view, in such a way that that teeny little slice works for the user and is shippable and potentially has value. It's a completely different way of thinking about software development. In my experience, it's a super powerful way of developing software. We talked about the updatable estimated. Sized appropriately. A lot of times what you'll get are these little teeny stories and then a couple like gargantuan huge stories. And as we noticed about the chip flip, when we did that, that was sort of all about batch size. You want small batches moving through the system. You want to be able to continuously learn from those batches. Well, if you have a huge story, that's like, imagine flipping chips and then suddenly you hit a chip that's this big and weighs 100 pounds. And you have to figure out some way of flipping that darn thing. So that's what happens if you get too big of stories when you're writing out your stories. And then you want to be able to test it. Originally, this is the notion here is you want to be able to test it from an architectural standpoint, functional and unit. In this side of the line, it actually is valuable over here, but not quite as valuable. On this side of the line, it's super important. Testable to me means you need to be able to test, was it valuable? You shipped it, but did anybody care? Because so often we release things and we have no ability to know, did anybody value that? And so baking into your architecture and the actual software ways of measuring value is super important. Pretty much anybody can write the user stories. The product owner is on the hook in Scrum for the user stories. They're the ones that rank it. The user story is used by the delivery team when they're building things out, the product owner when they're validating everything, and then management and the people around you can use it as a sense of like how much progress is being made. It's a proxy for progress. You can use personas. We've used a lot in here, jobs to be done. I prefer jobs to be done, but often in organizations you'll see personas. So I wanted to introduce those to you. We're going to skip that. Okay, so acceptance criteria, let's come back to that. Like I mentioned, it's really a way of clarifying the story, and it now starts to get into more of the traditional kind of product requirements docs. You can do everything from super lightweight bulleted items all the way down to RUP-like scenarios. So this is kind of a high level, like what bullet items would look like based on the user story at the top, and then kind of a checklist of functionality, what needs to be true for the story to be done and acceptable. You can go a little bit nutty and go into RUP-like scenarios where you have a formal grammar, like if we do this, in this path, this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen. You can do full UML diagrams on that if you want. Okay, so estimation. A powerful piece of this is, so you've got the stories. Now, the other side of it is, well, how long is it going to take to do? It's a question. Those of you who've been writing in industry, how many of you have been asked how long is that going to take? Okay. Yeah. Sometimes it's a gentle, like, hey, I don't know how long you think that's going to take. And sometimes it's a like, you know, your bonus rides on this being done on this date. You see sort of a wide range of this in industry. One fundamental problem, though, we suck at estimating. Completely suck at it. Humans are awful at this, if we do it in a certain form. So that's the Empire State Building. How tall is the Empire State Building in feet? Don't look it up.
2,000.
2,000 feet, okay, what else?
2,500.
2,500?
Isn't it 140 storage or something?
It's tall, yeah.
So
It's like 1,500.
1,500?
Like 1600?
Sorry?
Like 1600-ish?
Okay, yeah, you're pretty close. For those of you who've been to New York, how relative size to the Chrysler Building, how much smaller is the Chrysler Building than the Empire State Building?
Yeah, a couple hundred.
In percentages.
Probably like 10 or 20%. Yeah.
Yeah, 10 to 20%, cool. All right, so the Empire State Building is 1,250 feet tall, and the Chrysler Building is about 20% shorter than that. So notice here, we're kind of all over the map with height. You're about a 2x variance off of the actual, and that's a building. So it's pretty easy to calculate how long that's going to be. So sometimes in software, we can get tempted into thinking about lines of code or function points or all these like fancy ways that we've created to help us estimate. The reality is there's a much easier way of doing estimation that's more powerful, which is based on the observation that the human brain is really good at relative comparison. We suck at absolute distance, value, height, duration, but we're pretty good at relative size. So we know that that tall building is about 2x as tall as the one next to it, which is about 2x as tall as the one next to that. So we can do the same thing with stories. We can do relative estimation. But I encourage you to think about three components to those estimates, and you think about relative to other stories you've worked on, which is complexity, how much is going to go into this, effort, which is what sort of energy is it going to take to get this thing done, and then doubt, which is risk or unknowns or things like that. So when you first start developing your product, kind of when you're over in here, the complexity is probably fairly small because you're doing the first features. You don't really have anything to estimate against on effort, so it's sort of your best first guess. And then typically there's going to be a ton of doubt. I don't know, you've never used this platform before. You don't even know if this is valuable. So doubt is going to be a huge component to your estimation, so be sure and consider that. So if we think of feature one, or story one, there's different sizes or different components as we think about that. Like one may be pretty low on complexity, pretty high on effort, one may be like seriously big on doubt. You can think about sort of clumping those circles together, and then that gives you the relative size, or the size of that feature. And then you can compare them to against each other. Like, oh, that one's medium, that one's large. Then you can take that down to a number and say, well, all our mediums are 5, all of our larges are 13. And this one might be kind of fun. Do you want to do a little hands-on with this? Get, kind of break up the monotony of me talking. Okay, so now we're going to, instead of thinking about story points, which is what I just described, we're going to look at country points. So what I want you to do is, here's the list of countries that I want you to consider. And at the bottom there, we've got the Fibonacci sequence. So often when you do these estimations, instead of an absolute number, Fibonacci is a pretty powerful way to group things relative to each other. So I want you to break into like groups of 3 or 4. Go through this list, and I want you to compare these countries. Cool thing is, you can compare them on whatever dimension you want. And when you compare them, don't do it absolute, compare them relative to each other. So at the end of this, you should have countries that fall into the 1 bucket, countries that fall into the 2 bucket, the 3 bucket, the 5 bucket, the 8 bucket, the 13 bucket. You don't feel like you have to use all the buckets. Does that make sense what we're up to? And then at the end of this, if you could kind of figure out a spokesperson, and I will call Matt spokesperson to have you list out your countries and what buckets you put them in. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do this.